Okay, on this video we're going to talk a little bit about generator problems. This is a friend of mine's generator. He uses it for emergency power when he loses power, but I know a lot of you guys have campers that run generators, or trapping, if you're running like a trapping cabin and you're using a generator for power, like my buddy Norm, True North Living, check him out. When the generator doesn't start, it's a freaking headache. So this generator had a couple of different problems. As you can see, it's a Generac, a GP7500E. Now a lot of the Generac generators are set up the same way. It doesn't matter what the size is, they're pretty much all basically the same. This unit has electric start. So one of the problems on it was that the electric start didn't function. But even with switching the generator on, here's just the power switch for it here. Even switching the generator on, it would not start because it has a backup pull start on it here, you can see. But even pulling the pull start on it, it would not start. So basically for any engine, this is a single cylinder engine. It's 440cc. It needs three things to work. It needs spark, it needs compression, and it needs fuel. Now, a big issue with some of the generators is that people leave gas in them. They leave the fuel in it, and they'll leave the carburetor open. Most of these machines have a fuel shut off. You should always shut the fuel off. But people leave the old gas in it, and it goes stale, it goes off, it will get real brown, it will get discolored. Even if you put stabilizer in it, and there's all sorts of additives you can get to put in fuel. I don't really think they help any. Some maybe, but not a lot. But if you're going to store the generator long term, you want to empty it of fuel. Don't leave fuel in the tank. Don't leave fuel in the carburetor. So you want to run it dry as best you can. And this unit here has a carburetor like this, so it's pretty simple. Single barrel carburetor. This would be the choke lever here. You can see the choke closing. So if you look on the side of it here, it's got a bleed for the fuel bowl. This is the fuel bowl here where your float is for the carburetor. So this bolt here would take the bowl off the bottom of the carb, but the bowl on the bolt on the side here, you open that, it will actually drain the fuel out and then not leave the fuel in the bowl. The problem with gasoline now is that with the ethanol additives in it, ethanol of course is alcohol, and then alcohol absorbs water and you get phase separation, so you get sludging in the bowl here, and then it blocks the needle up that sucks the fuel up. What it does is it brings the fuel up through the needle here, and then the air coming through the carburetor that the engine is sucking in fuel with it as well. So you want to try and keep that out of it if you're going to store it long term. It's better off to store it dry. Then when you need it, put the fuel in it and start it, and you won't have any issue starting it. The issue with this generator, it kind of knocked me for a loop, and that's why I'm making the video. He tried to start, it wouldn't start. So I fixed the problem with the electric start, which was actually the solenoid. It has a power solenoid like this on the starter. And if you close the switch, there's a three-way switch on the generator here. So the center switch is on, pushing it down would be off, and then pushing up would be electric start to crank it to start it. So if I tapped on the solenoid here, it would try and start, but it wouldn't properly start. The thing with this generator was it's a negative feed solenoid. So the solenoid had power from the battery all the time, but when you close the start switch, it would ground the solenoid. Now that's different to a lot of things that I'm used to working on, where the solenoid would be grounded to the chassis of the vehicle, and then when you turn the ignition switch on to operate a starter or a snowplow, when you turn the button on to operate a snowplow, it would power the solenoid, and then the solenoid would close. So I took the Generac solenoid off of it. You can see it's a rinky-dinky little solenoid. And what I did was I put a truck solenoid on it and then rewired the truck solenoid into it. So I ran the ground wire to the base of the solenoid and then the power wire to the top of the solenoid where the power switch is. But in an emergency situation, if the solenoid didn't work and you really needed to use the electric start, and especially if you keep the generator outside and it's cold, the electric start will start a lot quicker than you will pulling on it, because these are not easy to pull start, especially because you're turning the generator. It's a direct drive, so you're turning the generator with the engine as well. But you can actually peel the two caps off here and then use a jumper wire and jump the solenoid to get the thing going, even if the solenoid doesn't work. But on from that, going back to our original problem, I tested it. I took the air cleaner box off, and I'll show you this in a little bit. I took the air cleaner box off of it. I sprayed some fuel into it. I sprayed some like starting fluid into it, and it still would not start. This was even after I got the electric start fixed. I tried starting it with the pull start. I sprayed ether in there to see if it would start. It would not start. I cleaned the fuel tank out of it. I made sure the fuel was clean. I put fresh fuel in it. It had a little bit of a problem with the carburetor, where the carburetor was letting a little bit too much fuel in, and it was kind of flooding it. But it still should have ran. It wasn't bad enough that it shouldn't have ran. But what I found was, when I put the spark tester on it with the switch in the run position, I put a spark tester on it and cranked it to see if I had spark, and the spark tester flashed, and I thought, okay, I've got spark. Even then, to test the plug, I took the spark plug out. Of course, you all know what a spark plug looks like. So there's an electrode on the top of the spark plug. The spark plug wire will go on this end, and when the spark plug wire energy comes down from the coil, and then you get spark here at the tip. Of course, that's what ignites your fuel. I took the spark plug out of the cylinder. I put the wire on it, and I grounded the spark plug to the engine block on the generator. And when I cranked it, I had spark. I could see the spark jumping on the top of the spark plug. So I thought, okay, the spark is all right. So I put the spark plug in. I even tried a new spark plug just in case. You'll see issues with spark plugs. You get bad electrodes. The tip of the spark plug will wear out. Sometimes you'll get lightning marks down the side of the plug. That would indicate that your wire is bad and your plug is bad at that point as well. So you would need to change both. The problem with these is that the ignition wire is actually mounted solid into the ignition coil. So I'll show you where the coil is in this, but here's a coil. This is actually from a tractor engine, but they're all pretty much the same. This is a dual wire one, so you can see the two spark plug wires because it's from a V-twin. And then this is the magnet, and the plate on the flywheel would pass over this, and that's what generates your spark. Every time it rotates and that plate makes or breaks, the contacts with the coil, the magnet with the coil, that's what makes and breaks your spark. So that's timed for top dead center on, well, this is only one cylinder, so it's time for top dead center on your cylinder. That's when you get your spark, or a couple of degrees before. But that kind of threw me for a loop, because I thought I had good spark. I changed the carburetor on and I repaired all that. Even with the ether, it still would not start. So I thought, okay, maybe it's got a problem with compression. I put a compression tester on it. I had like 75 pounds, 80 pounds of compression. That's way more than it needs to start. This also has a compression release on it. So if you look at the valves turning, if you take the valve cover off of it and you crank it by hand, you can watch the valves opening for all the different strokes of the engine. So of course it's a 4-stroke engine. There's 4 strokes. You have a power stroke, you have an exhaust stroke, you have an induction stroke, and you have a compression stroke. Now this has a compression release on it, so when it's not running, it actually vents the exhaust valve to lower the compression in the engine to make it easier for you to crank. Now sometimes I've seen where those will get stuck, and it will be very, very, very hard to pull the engine over, and that's a problem with the compression release. I've also seen it where the compression release won't stay off and it'll run really poorly. because it has low compression all the time. It's supposed to kick off. It's actually mounted on the camshaft, so to repair it, you need to disassemble the whole engine, which is quite an operation on a generator because you have to take the generator part of it off the engine as well. And then you have to split the case and then open it to get to the cams. But I had taken the exhaust off. I looked in the exhaust. I looked in the intake. Once you take the carburetor off, you can see right into the valves. And if you take the valve cover off, you can make sure that your valves are going up and down. Another thing you want to check on that is to make sure it didn't bump a push rod off, that your rockers are not, that your valves are actually opening. I've seen it where the rockers will pop off. There is valve adjustments on this, 6 thousandths clearance. So you have to make sure that you got proper clearance, because as the valve wears, it actually seats further and further up into the head. And when it does that, you have no clearance. And eventually what will happen is that the rocker arm will actually hold the valve open, and then you will have no compression. Sometimes too, with lack of maintenance, I've seen where the valves will stick. So you'll have an exhaust valve or an intake valve that's actually stuck down, and then once that happens, you'll have zero compression. So it'll be really easy to pull. But now, getting back to my story. I checked the compression. The compression was good. I knew I had good fuel, good clean fuel. A new carburetor. I knew I was getting properly metered fuel, that it wasn't flooding. At that point, I said I have to investigate the spark further. So what I did was, even though with the switch in the run position or the start position, and when I cranked it, I had spark at the spark plug. What I did was I went to the coil. I took the side cover off the generator. I took the pull start off, which is just 4 screws in the front. These are pretty much all Honda clone engines, so they're all pretty much the same as a Honda generator. So there's 4 screws to hold the pull start in the front. I removed that. There's another 4 or 5 screws to hold the flywheel cover case here in the front. I removed that. And then right on the top, I'll show you later in the video, right on the top, if you trace the spark plug wire in, it'll lead you directly to the coil. So at the bottom of the coil, I'll show you with my demo here, there's a ground wire. This is the wire it uses to turn the engine off. So what it does is it actually grounds this, and that grounds the coil, and then that will kill the spark production of the coil. So it's basically cutting the ignition. So what I did was I pulled the ground wire off like that, disconnected it, turned my fuel on, hit the crank button, and the thing fired right up. So what that tells me is that there's an issue with the start run switch. The start run switch has to be grounded, and it's providing a ground to my coil. Even though when I tested it with the switch in the run position, and I cranked it by hand or cranked it with the start outside of the cylinder, it showed that I had spark. Now, it may have been a weak spark, which is tough to determine. I have a tester that you can actually set the gap on it, and then you can put it into the spark plug wire and then ground it to the engine, and you can see how far the spark actually jumps a gap. Of course, the further it jumps, the stronger the spark is. But irrelevant to that, it's telling me that there has to be a problem with the start ignition run switch here, that it's constantly grounding and it's killing my coil, or it's weakening my coil enough that the spark can't jump inside once it's inside the cylinder. So I thought that would be beneficial for somebody to know, that you don't have to take, on this particular engine, you don't have to take the cover off to disconnect the coil wire. The ground wire to the coil here. It looks like it's going to look, they all look the same. Doesn't matter what engine it's on. It's going to have a little tab on it like that. That's going to provide a ground from the ignition switch. It will be the same with this. So that this will go to the ignition switch in the tractor. So when you go to start it and crank it, that is not grounded. And the engine, once the engine starts to turn, it generates spark, just like a motorcycle. But once you ground that wire is going to kill that coil, so it will actually stop the engine running. But that was the issue with this generator. The switch here is grounded. So there's a wire here on the side. Well, I'll give you a close-up of it in a minute. You can trace the black wire where it comes out from across the top of the engine to the coil, and it's got a quick connect plug that goes back up to this ignition switch here. This switch is part of this main board, the power board. So what I actually did to fix it was I wired in a separate switch because I couldn't get this switch on its own without getting the power board. But I wired in a separate switch which is going directly to ground. But what I did was I disconnected the wire from the coil that went to this and just ran my own ground to it. So now when I hit my own interrupter switch here, this will kill the engine. But that's what it was. Now it has a quick connect here, so I didn't actually need to take the cover off. I could just disconnect the coil wire. I didn't have a wiring diagram for it, so I wasn't sure. I just looked at the coil and disconnected the coil. And then once it started running, I knew exactly what my problem was. Now if you disconnect that wire and you still have no spark, then your coil is bad, so you're going to need a coil. These are all for electronic ignition. There's no points or anything involved with these. It's just a Hall effect pickup ignition. But yeah, if you unplug that wire and you still have no spark, you're going to need a new coil. The coil is bad. But on this one, that wasn't the case. Another thing you got to check on generators is they're very fond of putting low oil pressure switches in it, or low oil level switches in them. So I had disconnected that before to make sure that wasn't a problem. I checked the oil in it, the oil was full. But if the oil is low, they will not start. So you have to make sure the oil is full. There's a dipstick on the fill tube here. You know, open that and make sure that you've got enough oil in it. And the little switch is mounted in the side. Sometimes I've seen these switches go bad as well. There's a little switch here. There's a little switch that goes into the crankcase, and then there's a switch box outside of that. So you can disconnect that switch and see if the engine will start, because that will also interrupt the coil and it will kill the coil, and then the engine won't run. It'll shut off. That's designed for safety purposes. So if you're running it for a long period of time and the oil level goes low, that the engine is consuming some oil, that it will turn the engine off and not disintegrate your engine. So you never want to leave those disconnected like long term. You always want to replace that and repair it properly. But yeah, I thought that was kind of unusual that I still had spark. So I had spark even with the switch on, but once I put the spark plug in the cylinder, this thing would not fire. I could crank it for 10 minutes and it wouldn't fire. But as soon as I unplugged the coil, it fired right up. So that's what was wrong with it. This switch here, you can see if I go to bottom, it's off. If I go to center, that should be run. And then if I go up, it goes to start. So everything on it is fixed now, but I'll give you a rundown of where those parts are. So I hope those tips give you some help. If you're trying to get a generator started that won't start, those are the main things that you want to look at. Always start with the basic stuff. I should have checked that first, and I went a little bit further than I should have before checking that. But now I'm a little wiser for the fact that I'll check that first the next time, just to cut down on my diagnostic time on it. But like I said, try and keep it simple. You need the air, you need the fuel, you need the spark. Those three things, and it'll run. As long as it's not, it doesn't have a catastrophic failure, it will run. All right, let's show you where all this stuff is on it. Okay, I got a little bit of extra light here. So here's our oil dipstick. So you pull that out to check your oil level. Here's the solenoid that I wired into it. So these yellow wires here with the green connectors, those are the ones for the oil cutoff switch. You can see the oil cutoff switch right here. And then there's the switch box for it right here. So if you disconnect that, if that switch is bad and you disconnect this, then it should start. Now you can see here where I wired in the to my switch here. This is my new kill switch. So you can see here where I bypass that. I have it connected to ground, and then this is the wire here, this little black wire here that goes all the way into the coil here, which is under the case. This is the kill wire for the coil. So you can see here where the quick connect I have for it here. Here I split it to the ground, and I'll show you then where the this is the battery for the starter. So you can see here, this is the three-way switch. So center would be run, top would be start, bottom would be off. I'll show you where the coil is now. Okay, here's the side of the engine here. This is our fuel filter. This is the fuel shut off. Now this is the pull start right here, as you can see. So there's 4 screws to take that off. So you pull that off. And you have 1, 2 more on the bottom, 2 more on the bottom, 3, 4 down on the bottom here. And then you take this cover off here for your flywheel. The flywheel is underneath that. So the coil actually sits up here where that little hole is. It sits in here. You can see right here, this is the ignition wire right here. And if I follow it around, if I turn the machine a little bit. So here's our spark plug wire where it goes into the spark plug. This is our valve cover. So this is where you would take your spark plug wire off to test it. There's, you can see the spark plug right there. And then here's our carburetor. Now here's what I said earlier on about the drain for the fuel. You always want to drain them dry, run them dry. Don't store fuel in them. That's probably the worst thing you can do for it, especially with ethanol fuel. If you store it for 6-7 months without using it, the likelihood is you're going to try and start it and it won't start. Then you got to take the carburetor apart and clean it. Take your fuel tank, clean your fuel tank out. Of course, this is where you put the fuel in. But hopefully that'll help you out. Give you a little rundown here. It's air filter housing, so you can take that off and check it. If you want to spray fuel into it, you would open this, take the button off, take the cover off, take the little foam filter out, and then spray the ether directly into it to get it to start. Okay, so there's a rundown on the goings on with a generator. Hopefully some of those pointers will be able to help you out. So now if I switch my switch on, put my choke on, go to start. Start that up. Works, imagine that. Works like a charm. So hopefully that some of those tips will help you out. So tip number 1 learned from today is check that ground wire for the coil. It's a pretty simple thing to check. So if this ignition switch is bad, at least if you disconnect it, you will still be able to run the machine if you absolutely have to in an emergency and you need it. If there's an issue with this, or like I said, an issue with the low pressure switch, if you unplug those things, the generator will still start and run, and you'll be at least able to use it till you can get it repaired. But I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you on the next one.